Few people who were in London on 7th July 2005 will ever forget that day. That morning, 4 bombs went off, 3 aboard underground trains and 1 aboard a London double-decker bus. 52 people were killed and 700 injured by the 4 bombers, who also blew themselves up. The suicide attacks were carried out by young Muslim men who had travelled from their homes in Leeds and Aylesbury with their homemade explosives. In pre-recorded video statements, they pledged loyalty to Al-Qaeda and said the attacks were in response to Britain's involvement 2 years earlier in the invasion of Iraq and its support for Israel. Among the dead and wounded were Muslims. It was an attack carried out in a city where in 2003 more than 2 million people had marched against the Iraq war. Some of those were killed or injured on 7/7. In this programme, we look back at the tragic events of 7/7 and how they have impacted on British society. We talked to Ken Livingstone, Mayor of London at the time, Anas Altikriti, who was then President of the Muslim Association of Britain, and Lindsey German, Convenor of the Stop the War Coalition. Where were you when you first heard the news of the 7/7 bombings?
Well, of course, the day before we'd had the Olympic vote in Singapore, and I was actually shopping when Joy Johnson, my head of media, phoned to say there's been some disruption on the tubes, 3 things have broken down. And then about 10 minutes later she phoned to say she thought it might be something much worse. So I was desperately looking for a cab to get back to the hotel and get plugged into what was happening.
I was actually lecturing at the time. There was a small course that I was lecturing at Leeds University of all places, and the news filtered through as we were in the class. At first, I didn't really filter the enormity of the news, but upon ending the class fairly early and then catching up on the news, it became quite clear that it was a major incident. By that time, my phone had rung several times from media sources asking me for a comment and the such, and I had to pack up my bags very quickly and travel down to London. Now, obviously, the interesting thing about this was that it clearly, shortly afterwards, became clear that the perpetrators were from Leeds. In fact, one of them, I understand, prayed in a mosque that I had also frequented 2 or 3 times.
Woke up in the morning and there was all the stuff on the radio. There's a problem with the tubes, and this began to be announced. And I remember some guy, I was still listening to it because nobody really knew what was happening, and some guy came on a phone in and he said, look, my friend's just phoned me, and he said he saw a bus blow up in central London, which of course turned out to be true. So then we knew the original story that they told, that this was a sort of power surge or something, obviously wasn't true, and it was a terrorist attack, which obviously all the security forces and the mayor's office, no doubt, and the government were all aware of that before that. So that was when I was there, and I knew, when I began to hear about it, I knew it sounded very bad. And of course we knew that if that were a serious terrorist attack, as it turned out to be, that would alter the whole sort of political way in which we'd operated and stopped the war, because we'd always said there's not been a terrorist attack in Britain. It was one of our arguments. And of course, once 7/7 happened, of course, you couldn't say that anymore. There had been this attack.
I think that the very first thing that comes to mind is the people who have died and the people who were seriously wounded. The images that came through were quite horrific, quite graphic, and the stories that started to filter through showed that the way in which these attacks were orchestrated, the bus attack, the attacks on the tube and the such, the very first thing that comes to mind and has to come to mind are those who were affected, those who were worried. I mean, I had a friend of mine whose daughter was on a trip to London that day, and for a couple of hours he was worried sick for the sake of his daughter, who might have been, it turned out that she wasn't anywhere near the place.
Well, we'd known that we were bound to be attacked after the invasion of Iraq in 2001. I mean, Tony Blair was warned by the security services that getting involved would make us a target of terrorism. What surprised me was that, so long had gone by and we hadn't been attacked. I mean, I assumed it'd be a much quicker response. And I was beginning to think that summer of 2005 that perhaps, we're going to, avoid it. The head of MI5 came to have discussions with me, and I said that. She said, no, it's very, very dangerous out there. And so we'd been waiting for it. We'd done a huge amount of work preparing the response and so on. And it pretty much all worked perfectly on the day. The interesting thing is, if you look at the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, he's totally opposed to violence. I mean, his final sermon, he tells Muslims that they shouldn't invade, occupy, terrorise or convert others. They should get to know other tribes and nations. So this little extreme strand, that's no more typical of Islam than Judaism is typified by the American rabbi who said 1,000 Arab lies aren't worth a Jewish fingernail, or the Baptist preacher in America who, after the July bombings in London, said he regretted more people hadn't been killed before we tolerate homosexuality. Every religion has its nutty fringe. What was very good about the response in London, there's no police record of any attack on a Muslim. No one assaulting a Muslim, throwing a rock through a window of a mosque or anything like that. We went through London and remained absolutely united. But we'd put a real effort into reaching out to the Muslim community, and also trying to get across to people that, Muslims aren't something out of pagan times,
Well, we took the view that it was a terrible atrocity, but that actually you couldn't disconnect it from the war on terror. And one of the things that we said, it wasn't just us, but Eliza Manning and Buller, who was from MI5, had also made the point that if you go to war in Afghanistan, if you go to war in Iraq, you will actually create much greater terrorism, and people will seek to kill people in London, in New York, as we've seen has happened. So we reacted to it by saying we totally condemn what has happened on the London Tube, but at the same time, we believe this is a product of war and we have to fight against the war. And we had a very big protest in the square, and in fact the police wouldn't open the square gardens for us, and it was an absolutely boiling hot day and we had absolutely no shade because they were very hostile to it and so on. But we thought it was important to have a protest which was against terrorism but against war and against Islamophobia.
At first, it doesn't really matter. It's a criminal attack, and whoever carried out that attack must be labelled as a criminal. That's the very first thing that comes to mind. But I think that when you sort of get sense of how the media are going to, or certain sectors of the media are going to run with the story, particularly when they start asking you certain questions about how do you feel about these people being Muslims. Well, the same as I would feel as if the perpetrators were Christians. It doesn't really matter. But I got a sense of that. But I think that the turning point and the real hallmark of London and of Londoners at the time was manifested in the stand of the then mayor, Ken Livingstone, who came out and said, he spoke so eloquently and so movingly about how London will not be moved by these cowardice and cowardly attacks. But at the same time, the Muslims of London are Londoners as well, and he would never stand for anyone attacking Muslims. I think that laid out precisely what, at the time, what London meant for everyone concerned.
Well, I'd known this was coming, and my response would be important. And I'd thought about it for years. What will I say when these bombs go off? And I never wrote anything down. I remember one of my key advisors says, "What are you going to say?" And I said, "I can't talk about it." And when I got back to the hotel and we had the confirmation of the bombings, I went down to the pool, which was empty, and I swam for about half an hour and thought through in my head what I was going to say. Because I think it had to be spontaneous. You couldn't stand up and read out some speech that had been prepared and your staff had checked it. It had to be what you really felt.
Those who came here to kill last Thursday had many goals, but one was that we should turn on each other like animals trapped in a cage. And they failed. They failed totally and utterly. There may be places in the world where still that would have happened, but not here.
The main message was to try and prevent this then escalating into something worse, and so I trying to get across to people that, you know, this doesn't represent London's Muslim community, but also to get across to non-Muslims that they shouldn't fall into the trap of turning on the Muslims, because that's what the jihadists want. If you get a backlash against Muslims, it will mean more young recruits going over, and that was the point I tried to get across, that, you know, we mustn't lash back, but also to get across the optimism, because I mean, I'd lived through 25 years of IRA bombings in London, you know. We didn't turn on, well, there were some anti-Irish incidents, but not much. And to get across to people, this won't mean people start leaving London. Or, I mean, I remember saying that if you look at airports and next in the weeks to come, you'll see people arriving from all over the world, and they come here not to bring, you know, fanaticism. They come here because they want to be part of Britain, to be free, to achieve their own potential, and that was the powerful message to get across, really.
Well, I think that as one security chief put it a few months earlier, that it was almost a miracle that an attack, at the time we didn't know the magnitude, but an attack hadn't already happened. This was earlier in 2005. And I think that those sentiments are precisely what most people felt, that the involvement, the heavy involvement of Britain under the leadership of Tony Blair in the Iraq War, in the so-called war on terror, in the demonization that started to take place at the time of Muslims, particularly abroad, but also creeping into Western European countries, as well as you know, the despicable stand on the rights of the Palestinians and various other issues which were extremely dear to, you know, hundreds of billions around the world, Muslims and none, by the way. I think that I would echo the sentiments of that security chief at the time, his name I forget, that it was a miracle that it took until July of 2005 for such an attack to happen.
You know, the war on terror, which has been renamed on a number of occasions for good advertising and branding reasons, that you don't want to keep promoting something which is so obviously a failure. You look at what bin Laden controlled in 2001 in parts of Afghanistan he controlled. Look at ISIS today. Look at the other countries in the Middle East and in large parts of Africa. Terrorism is a real problem. We know it's a problem in this country. We know it's a problem across Europe. It's become something that has been exacerbated and in many parts created by the war. Patrick Cockburn made this point in his recent book. He said that ISIS is the child of war. It's the product of war, and that's absolutely true.
Well, I think at the time the change was quite positive, because it showed that, I mean, the Muslim communities at the time came out all as one, and it was as though they were reading from the very same sheet. The utter and unequivocal and unconditional condemnation was the name of the game, and I think that that was something which showed a lot of maturity. The way in which all societies and communities that made up London and indeed the United Kingdom, I think, coming together in the way that they did under the leadership then of Ken Livingstone, the Mayor of London, I think it showed a side of Britain that we wish would come to the fore more often. And you know, for that subsequent period, I think that the people did come together. It's so unfortunate that, similar to the case of 9/11 in New York, there was a moment when everyone came together, everyone agreed that this was a crime, this was despicable. But then politicians managed to scupper that particular moment, and all of a sudden divisive politics came at the fore, and we had the cycle that led us to where we are today. Islamophobia on the rise, the involvement of Britain in failed projects abroad, you know, as never before, and again, Britain under the threat of another attack every single day, we are told.
Well, I think it was a very, very difficult time for Muslims, actually, obviously because they immediately faced a range of attacks, just as they did after 9/11, that you get people who immediately respond to this by physically attacking Muslims or mosques or other Islamic organisations. But I think it did mark a change. I think it increased the level of Islamophobia. It increased the level of surveillance and restrictions on civil liberties. And I think Muslims have very much suffered in those intervening 10 years. And now, of course, we've got this, we've got Prevent, we've got the whole stuff about British values, that if your child doesn't believe in Father Christmas, or if your adolescent child doesn't shop in Marks and Spencer's, then maybe they're being radicalised, that you don't have to be violent, even non-violent extremism leads to extremism. So I think this has been this was the beginning, in a way, of a sharper attack on Muslims, which is still continuing.
Well, in that aftermath of the bombing, there were no attacks on Muslims. They weren't being demonised. But we've had a lot of that since. I mean, the Anders Breivik, the man who killed, over 70 children. When you look at his website, it's filled with quotes from the Daily Mail, and there's been some of our papers really pushing a anti-Muslim view. So I think there is most probably a bit more anti-Islam feeling in Britain. And I think to a degree that's alienated a small minority of young Muslims who feel here's a double standard. America and Britain invade Muslim countries, and there's no punishment for the things they do. I mean, you had the first directly elected Muslim mayor removed from office on completely trumped up charges. And I mean, a month later at the election, 37% of the local community voted for his successor. They didn't believe it. No, there is that anger. And so I think, and particularly David Cameron tends to pander a bit to Islamophobia. Whereas the absolute key role I felt I had as mayor was to bring people together, not look what divides them.
Can anyone imagine them doing this with any other religion? Church closure orders because people are extremists within it, or synagogue closure orders because there's extremist views expressed. Nobody would dream of thinking that this was a sensible way to deal with what may be a real problem. And I think that what you've now got is that the government, backed up by the media, backed up by these right-wing institutions like the Henry Jackson Society, are really trying to drive this agenda, and it will have horrible consequences if we're not careful with it, because it is leading to, there's a kind of thought police going on if we're not careful, and it is going to lead to further attacks on Muslims. We should also remember, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the IRA launched many attacks in London. Many. I mean, regularly there were bombings. It was very, very common that you had quite big bombings in London. They killed, or one of the Irish Republican groups killed Margaret Thatcher's, one of her closest advisors, was killed in Parliament, in the car park. The Queen's uncle was blown up off the coast of Ireland. And you never had all of these laws. And even then, even with all the Irish, virtually all of the ones who were convicted were found later to have been innocent. So I think there's lots and lots of questions here that we're not getting answers from the government about.
It's quite despicable, the kind of language that our government wishes to pursue and wishes to put out there. A language which at the time, if any right-minded politicians would have ever dreamed of speaking, they would have been described as utter racists, and probably their political careers would be on the line. But today, a Home Secretary no less can actually speak in terms of the Muslim community being sort of on the peripheries of society. It doesn't really belong, because their rights aren't, well, they do have rights, but not as anyone else, and their responsibilities are fairly more than everyone else. Of measures that one wouldn't have imagined of Britain today, merely 2-3 years ago, confiscating people's passports and locking down places simply because they dared invite someone at some stage, all measures being, retroactively and retrospectively. So if someone, housed someone 15 years ago who today is found or suspected of anything, then that person 15 years ago would be hauled before the security forces. It's just unspeakable. And like I said, I only wish, obviously I wish for the crime of 7/7 never to have happened, but the spirit of of collaboration and community and empathy that came to the fore immediately after. That's something that I wish we could have bottled and we could do a huge dose of today.
When you have these policies, when you have this level of surveillance, when you have these things going on, when you have people believing that somehow there is some solution in doing these kind of things, yes, it will go on. And the more they criminalise the Muslim community, the harder it will be to break people from those kind of politics.
At the beginning of this programme, I said few of those of us living in London on that terrible morning 10 years ago have forgotten where they were when they heard the news that day. Many expressed anger that a city which had overwhelmingly opposed the Iraq War and which was the most multiracial in Europe with a major Muslim community should be targeted in this way. In looking back 10 years, our first thoughts must be with the victims of this criminal attack, the dead and the wounded, many who still carry the very visible scars of that day, externally and internally. It's a day that will forever haunt them. Tragically, few people feel London is a safer place than it was 10 years ago. In the course of making this programme, further anti-terrorist legislation was put in place by the government. As a governor at a primary school in London, I now find myself legally responsible for looking out for evidence of radicalisation among pupils, staff and parents. The 7/7 bombing has cast a long shadow, but 10 years on the threat to London of another terrorist attack remains. Indeed, the world is today a more dangerous place. This is the monument in London's Hyde Park to the innocent victims of the 7/7 attack. Despite the nearby traffic in Park Lane, it's a place where you can find peace to think about the awfulness of that day 10 years ago.